Today on the Playbook Podcast, a government shutdown is now just 1 week away, and this time it looks like it might actually happen. We've got all the fallout from Donald Trump's big U-turn on Ukraine, and we've got the latest news from the wilderness with not one but two losing Democratic presidential candidates coming out of the woodwork this week. Hello, I'm Jack Blanchard.
And I'm Adam Wren, and it's Wednesday, September 24th.
And this is the Playbook Podcast. Good morning, Adam. How are you doing?
Doing well, Jack. Good to be with you.
I have been looking at my calendar and counting down the days, Adam, to the 1st of October when the government is supposed to shut down if no funding deal is agreed by Congress. Now, these stories are always kicking around in the political cycle on the Hill. Oh, there's going to be another shutdown. And then there's always a last minute deal, and it generally doesn't quite happen. But this time it feels like this is actually on the cards. And that's why I want us to talk about this morning. There's only 1 week of money left for the federal government. And yesterday, Donald Trump canceled the last minute talks he was supposed to be having with the Democratic leadership on the Hill, Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries, which takes away one of the possible off ramps that might have led us out of this. And it's now looking increasingly likely that the federal government will indeed partially shut down next Wednesday morning. So I think we'd better get into the politics of that, Adam, because it's obviously a big political moment and coming now just over a year out from the midterms. There's a sort of theory around in American politics that when this does happen, it's the party that wouldn't agree to the spending deal that gets the blame from the American public. And in this case, in theory, that would be the Democrats. So why do you think the Democrats and Chuck Schumer are really toying with this and maybe now ready to go ahead with it?
Well, Jack, I think Chuck Schumer in particularly learned earlier this year that that his base wants him to fight essentially Trumpism and MAGA and show some backbone. And I think going into this, he knows that he has to handle it differently than he did earlier this year. It's not at all clear to me that will result in a political win for Democrats on this. But at the same time, Republicans control, all major levers of power here. They control the White House. They control both the House and the Senate. And the onus in some ways is on them to produce a spending bill. But I think that essentially backing out of this meeting with Schumer and Jeffries, Republicans felt like they needed to maintain, some kind of leverage, and that having this meeting would erode that leverage. Although, Trump is always sort of game for these kinds of meetings. He likes the optics. He likes kind of being a deal maker in chief and kind of pressing the flesh here. So it is a little surprising that he would do this, but apparently Johnson and Thune got to him and persuaded him to cancel this meeting.
Feels to me like the Republicans actually want this to happen now, for him to have done that in such a public way. I think for them, they only see upside in a government shutdown because they do think the Democrats will be blamed by voters who not unreasonably just want their government to stay open and function in a basic normal way. We know the Republicans have put forward a short-term spending bill. The Democrats want extra spending added onto it. They say essential healthcare spending. The Republicans obviously don't see it that way. There's another interesting aspect to it as well, which is like how the government would function under a shutdown, because there's a lot more flexibility given to the executive branch to spend money as it sees fit when the government is in a state of shutdown. And so in a sense, it would give Donald Trump and his budget chief, Russ Vought, much more power over spending than in theory they already have. So it really does pose big questions for the Democrats if they do press ahead with this. It feels to me that the analogy I made in the Playbook newsletter this morning, Adam, it feels to me a bit like the Cory Booker speech. If you can cast your mind back to earlier in the year when Cory Booker, the Democratic senator, stood up and gave a 25-hour filibuster on the floor of the Senate. It was the longest speech in American political history. It achieved absolutely nothing whatsoever, right? Not a thing. There was no political policy consequence of him doing this amazing thing, but it showed Democratic supporters that someone was prepared to stand up and do something and fight back in whatever way that they could, in whatever way is available to a single senator on the floor of the Senate, to do something to show they were trying to obstruct the things that the Trump administration is trying to do. And this feels a bit like that to me, a sort of ultimately futile gesture, but one that the Democrats feel like they just have to make.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot at stake here. I don't get the sense that the Democrats are joyously walking into the shutdown. You look at the off-year election in Virginia this year. You know, Virginia is home to many federal workers. It looks like Democrats are going to walk away with the gubernatorial race so far. But you know, there could be consequences in this shutdown depending on where voters assign blame. And you know, if Abigail Spanberger, you know, feels some heat from this, with all of the federal workers who call Virginia home, you know, losing potentially some of their wages, that could be a significant problem.
Let's talk about Donald Trump. It's not often we get a few minutes into the podcast without barely having mentioned the president. Everyone will have seen his pretty extraordinary performance at the United Nations in New York yesterday. A real fire and brimstone performance before world leaders. Actually, more consequential than his hour-long speech, though, was the meeting he had with Vladimir Zelensky afterwards, the Ukraine president, and the repercussions of that meeting are still being felt in Washington today and potentially will be felt around the world for some time, because it feels, Adam, now that Zelensky, after months of trying different approaches with Trump, has finally landed his message. And the statement, if we can call it that, that Donald Trump put out on Truth Social at the end of that meeting was essentially backing Ukraine's position in this war, really for the first time since the war broke out. Donald Trump sounds on board with Zelensky and Ukraine in a way that we've really never heard from him before.
This was stunning, Jack, and I think if there's a common through line through both the UNGA speech and this pivot on Ukraine, it's the sense that Donald Trump doesn't like to be made a fool. He doesn't like to be laughed at. You know, 7 years ago, he arrived at the UNGA, and what was laughed at by some world leaders, and nobody was laughing yesterday when he gave the speech. They were forced by his political hand here to pay attention to him. And when it comes to Ukraine, it's the same story. You know, he had this big red carpet summit for Putin. Thought that he had gained some mileage here. And some daylight, and it's all sort of evaporated. So it seemed like Zelensky was effective in getting Trump to realize that he had to do something to shake up Putin's calculus here.
Yeah, I mean, the position of the West before Trump came back in throughout this war had always been Ukraine will fight and fight and fight and get back what Russia took from it. And it was only when the Trump administration came in that that conversation started to change. And we heard from Pete Hegseth and others went over to Europe and said, that ain't coming back. Like some of that land that they've taken, we're going to have to write that off. That was the first time major Western leaders had said that, certainly publicly. And that started to become the accepted position. And we heard from Trump over the summer laying out these peace proposals where there was a sort of going to be a quid pro quo where Russia would get to keep all of the land, which, to be clear, it had illegally seized by invading, but nevertheless was going to be allowed to keep it. Now we have Donald Trump saying he believes Ukraine can win all of Ukraine back in its original form with time and patience, get the original borders from where this war started. This is essentially Joe Biden's position on Ukraine, although Trump wouldn't thank me for pointing that out. This has been the traditional sort of, if we can put it that way, Western position the whole time. And Trump is now on board.
There have been a number of times throughout his second presidency where I think Donald Trump has gotten to kind of the consensus foreign policy or domestic policy position. But along the way to get there, he had to do sort of his own homework and arrive at that consensus answer. And I wonder if that's what we're seeing again here on Ukraine.
I did talk to one European diplomat last night who sort of was pleased with what Trump had said, but sort of sighed and said, yeah, now the thing we just have to make sure we do is not let the president speak to anybody else for the next few years, because there is a sense in some European capitals that the last person to get in Trump's ear is very much the one that's got the message at that moment. He'd obviously just seen Zelensky when he posted this long message on Truth Social. And, you know, as ever with this president, there has to be the caveat that what is his position today may not prove to be his position tomorrow or next week or next month or indeed next year. And so we shall have to see how much this is borne out in reality. But it certainly feels like a big moment. Shall we talk briefly about the Democrats and Donald Trump's former opponents, Adam? Because we've seen not one but two defeated Democratic presidential candidates out and about this week. This morning, we'll see Hillary Clinton back in the spotlight. She's going to be doing TV Morning Joe this morning. She's going to be speaking at an event in New York as well. Yesterday, we saw Kamala Harris making her return to the morning airwaves. And going back over her defeat to Donald Trump last year. Is this healthy for the Democrats, do you think, all this sort of going back over the past and trying to work through what happened?
Well, Jack, I think that there's a certain amount of hand wringing happening in the Democratic Party here. The party vastly wants to pivot to talk about the future, whether it's 2026 or 2028. And here are two tribunes of the past. I mean, maybe Harris runs again in 2028, but based on the book, it sure doesn't seem like it. And these people, still are coming forward with backward looking assessments of what went wrong for the party, and no one's kind of providing a forward-looking assessment of where the party needs to go. And what's interesting, particularly to me, about this Harris rollout is she kind of slags some of her, fellow Democrats who want to run in 2028. Whether it's someone like Tim Walz, who's currently running for re-election in Minnesota for governor, whether it's someone like Pete Buttigieg or Josh Shapiro, the governor of Pennsylvania. I mean, she's kind of taking all of these people down a peg at a time when the party wants to see them and others like Maryland Governor Wes Moore, Kentucky Governor Beshear kind of launch out and shape a path for the party into the future. And here they are, beat back ceaselessly into the past. I think party operatives and leaders are frustrated with this book and are surprised by it. There was a broad sense that Harris was going to, write a book that wasn't as candid as this one is, and was more sort of reflective on leadership abilities and something like that, setting her up for a potential, speaking gig. But she really kind of burned all the boats here with this one.
You bet. Before we go, Adam, we should talk about the silliest story that's been kicking around the DC news bubble for the last 24 hours, which of course is Escalator Gate. Now, if you didn't follow this yesterday, just before Donald Trump's big speech to the UN, the escalator he and Melania Trump were taking to get up to the hall broke down, and the poor president and first lady had to walk up. Bless them. Then when he got there, his teleprompter wasn't working properly. But he struggled through and still managed a 56-minute speech, which made headlines around the world. But nevertheless, the White House are now, and other MAGA supporters too, are accusing the UN of sabotage. There was a report in the Times of London from a couple of days ago that UN officials had been joking in the building about breaking the escalator or whatever, so he'd have to walk up. And then sure enough, that actually happened. And so I saw Caroline Levitt, Trump's press secretary, on Fox News last night, literally saying it appears to be sabotage. She put out a message on social media demanding an investigation at the UN. They're taking this quite seriously, Adam. The UN says this isn't what happened, but nevertheless, MAGA will seem very upset.
Yeah, I mean, to give them their due, this is taking place, not long after Charlie Kirk's memorial service. There are, any number of security concerns the day after one of his assassins, was in court attesting for this. And so I think that they're certainly sensitive, but also at the same time, this is the kind of stuff that George W. Bush had two shoes thrown at him at a press conference, infamously, and so no world leader is safe from these kinds of potentially embarrassing moments.
The UN is apparently blaming it on Trump's own videographer, who was up in front of him on the elevator, and is now being blamed for somehow its malfunction. Anyway, maybe one day we'll get to the bottom of this this crisis for the president. Adam, thank you for being here. Thank you everyone for listening. That's all we've got time for on today's show. We've got loads more news and analysis in today's Playbook newsletter, which you can find at politico.com/playbook. And we, as always, will be back tomorrow. Have a wonderful day.